All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our Youth Climate Justice panel hosted by us at Solar One. My name is Amy Colorado. I am joined by 5 wonderful youth activists who will introduce themselves in just 1 second. As everyone is coming in, I just wanted to let everyone know that we are using the Zoom webinar platform, meaning that all of the attendees are going to be muted and their cameras are off during the entire presentation. This webinar platform, panel platform is going to be recorded. And that recording is going to be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So we will send everyone that YouTube link in case you wanted to share what you saw today with someone else, or in case you just wanted to rewatch it or just have it for your records, that will be sent to everyone. And so just a little quick introduction. I work for an organization called Solar One. We are a nonprofit environmental organization based in New York City. So I know that we may have people joining us from all over, but I am right now located in New York City. And so a lot of what we do this summer is that we've been having these weekly webinar series specifically targeting youth. And I'm very excited to be able to have today's event because we are really trying to use our platform and our organization and our organization's reach to be able to uplift and amplify some of these voices within the climate movement. And so I'm glad to be able to be joined today by some youth climate activists. So if everyone can just go around and start introducing themselves. I know everyone's like set up on their Zoom grid view may be a little different. So I'll just have Jade start, if that's okay. And then whoever wants to go after her to just introduce ourselves so we know who we're speaking with today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for hosting this and having all of us talk about our experiences in climate activism. My name is Jade Lozada. I'm the Policy Director of TREEage, which is a youth climate organization in New York City. We mobilize young people to elect climate leaders to office and in support of equitable climate policy. Right now, we're working on this really exciting campaign called The Hive, which is about bringing climate education to schools. I started as a organizer of the September 20th climate strike, as did some other people here. And yeah, and now I'm here a year ahead of that, and I'm really excited for what's ahead. So I will pass on to whoever would like to introduce themselves next.
I'll go. Hi guys, my name is Alexia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-founder of Start Empowerment, and we're a social and environmental justice education program, and we work with different schools in New York City to implement justice-focused curriculums and then also action-oriented community organizing with students.
Hi, my name is Cynthia. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Climate Science Communication for Youth. And the whole purpose of CSCY is to bridge the gap between the science professional field and the climate advocacy space. And the whole point of CSCY as well is to empower BIPOC. We are led by women of color and we are BIPOC empowered. So, yeah, and I first started organizing with the New York City Strike Coalition, and while I was involved, I actually proposed a climate education law, S7341, to my state senator, which got introduced into both state legislatures. So, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us today. My name is Xiye Bastida, and I'm an 18-year-old climate justice activist. I have worked in New York City with People's Climate Movement and Fridays for Future NYC, and I recently founded Re-Earth Initiative, which is an international youth-led organization dedicated to highlighting the intersectionalities of the climate crisis, always recognizing that it is about social justice if we want to achieve climate justice. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here and share a little bit about my journey with all of you.
Hi everyone, my name is Hidesh Singh. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm based in Rochester, New York. I helped co-found the New York Youth Climate Leaders back in November of 2019 after organizing for climate justice in my local community here in upstate New York for the past 4 years. The New York Youth Climate Leaders is a policy-driven coalition of over 65 youth organizations from across the state dedicated to advocating for economic and environmental justice. Currently, we've been focusing on trying to divest public assets away from the fossil fuel industry, and we actually just scored a huge, major victory just a couple weeks ago when we got our state's public pension fund, which is the largest fund of public assets in our state, to divest away from coal, making it one of the first pension funds to divest away from coal. So we've been really excited about that win in our campaign and continue to advocate for various just policies to uplift low-income communities and communities of color across the state.
Ooh, that is so great. I'm so excited. And I think it's really great how some of you may already know each other or may have worked with one another before, or maybe have learned from each other's organizations. And if not, we have now. And so that's great that we're not all able to connect here today. I just wanted to mention to all of our attendees, if anyone at any point has a question for any of the panelists on our panel today, you can please type in your question in the Q&A kind of portion on Zoom. So that should be at the bottom of your screen on that bar. There should be a Q&A section, and we will try our best to get to your question. We do have a dedicated Q&A portion of this panel all the way at the end. We're going to dedicate about 20-25 minutes to answering some audience questions. So yeah, feel free to start inputting your questions, and we're going to try to get to them all the way at the end. And so a question that we received a lot from audience members when they were registering, and something that I'm also wondering, is kind of how each of you, you're all so successful in the sense of, you know, you've gone out and you've founded and, you know, created these organizations that are doing amazing work in the climate movement, and really are being leaders in all the changes that are happening locally here in New York, but then also, you know, on a national level. So I just wanted to learn a little bit from each of you of how you all got started, how, you know, because I'm assuming there was a lot of work that went into where you all are today. So if I can just hear from all of you of just, you know, how did this process look like for you? What was that journey like of being involved and becoming such climate leaders? So I'll take it of whoever feels comfortable to start. And hopefully, you know, we can have more, this can be more of a conversation.
I guess I can go. So my journey as a climate activist, you know, I always say that it started really with my parents raising me to be aware of our surroundings, as they both met in the first Earth Summit in 1992, and they both studied sustainable development, and they both led initiatives in my town in Mexico to clean our river because it's so polluted. So I kind of grew up with that, knowing that we have to be involved in a certain way. But I didn't really start my own journey in climate activism until 2015, when I was invited to Malaysia to the World Urban Forum to speak about youth perspectives and the climate movement. And that was the first time in which I ever spoke to adults about what the youth thought, about the lack of climate education, about the lack of including Indigenous voices in the conversation, about the lack of centering people of color in solutions. And people were shocked that a youth was talking to them about climate. And that's when I realized that we do have a certain power of agency being youth in this moment, because we are stakeholders of the future, and the future has, you know, been at stake for a long time right now. So when I came back to New York from that trip to Malaysia, I decided to join my environmental club, because that's the only thing that I thought I could have an influence in. So I joined my environmental club And it was very geared towards kind of like recycling, very like rudimentary environmentalism. And we cannot get out of the climate crisis by only recycling, by only doing those like tiny things, when we have systemic change in our hands as youth as well. So that's why I took leadership of the environmental club and decided to organize my school to actually go lobby politicians. We lobbied for the CLCPA, the Climate and Leadership Community Protection Act. I testified at City Hall so that they would declare climate emergency. We went to Albany several times to lobby with NY Renews. And the thing is that a lot of youth don't realize that we can do these things. We can go and lobby, we can go and testify. And these are things that we should be more empowered to do. And after I realized that a lot of politicians didn't really listen to everything that we were doing, that's when I decided to organize my school to strike. And in the first strike on March 15th, we got 5,000 kids to strike all over the city. And that's where I met other fellow climate organizers. And we came together to start Fridays for Future NYC. And it just grew and grew until September 20th, when over 6 youth climate organizations came together to organize the biggest climate strike that New York City had ever seen. And it was super empowering. I organized with Jade, and Cynthia was also there sometimes. And it was just really empowering to see that we could get 300,000 people to march down the street with you, because we all want to see the world just be a better place and be more conscious. And right now, after all of that, and when COVID happened, I realized we couldn't strike anymore. So that's when I decided to start my own 501c3 called Re-Earth Initiative, which is led by youth of color from all over the world, because I feel like we have to actually bring voices of youth from countries that are not represented in the climate movement as much as they should, especially because I come from Mexico and I see that a lot of those voices are not as uplifted as they should be.
I can go ahead. I got my start through a spoken word poetry program called Climate Speaks. It was presented by the Climate Museum, and it appealed to me. I saw it through an Instagram ad like spring of 2019, because I've always been a writer and I really wanted to perform. And when I had to write the poem about the climate crisis, I had to realize like what resonated with me personally. And as a New Yorker and as a student who commutes to the Bronx like to go to high school regularly, I realized that the story that was most relevant to me was how Black and Brown communities in low-income neighborhoods of New York City are really chosen for like the worst, most polluting projects in the city. How they have disproportionate rates of asthma and other health complications from the pollution. It is incredibly unfair, and it's a racist system. And it took me like writing that poetry to realize that. Once I did that, it was kind of a motivation to keep going. I had this personal story now, and I couldn't just like stop there. It felt wrong when this climate movement was emerging, like resurging. So I went to my first Fridays for Future meeting that summer, which is where I met Xiye and Cynthia. And I went to my meeting thinking that I was going to find out like when and where the strike is and how to tell people at my school. But they said, get into committees and start organizing. So when I went to the arts committee, then she was like, oh, do you want to help like coordinate this? And that's how I ended up as one of the organizers for the strike. After that all happened, I joined the organization of a fellow strike like organizer named Shiv Soen, who founded TREEage, because I realized personally that I wasn't as much in the streets, like yell as loud as I can climate activist, but that I really wanted to be behind the scenes, making the relationships that make change happen.
So I actually first got involved with organizing first by, well, When I was first at the United Nations, I was doing work around advocating for mental health and ADHD. And while I was there, I actually met a few other climate organizers from around the world where I helped organize a All in for Climate Action rally with, like, for example, a youth delegate of Germany. And I remembered there was a group chat with like different organizers, and there was even one person, like not just one person, there were like different people included as well that were from the New York City Climate Coalition. And I actually met Xiye from the group chat, and I was like DMing her like, how can I get involved, like blah blah blah. And so I got on like my first call with her, and she was leading a class. And actually, like, I think that the class that she led was what kind of just like inspired me and like really like understand like what my climate story was, because like obviously before coming into the climate movement, I really did think that this was just like a white dominated space, and like I really didn't think that I would be affected by climate change at all. Like, oh, like what's yeah. And so for example, she was talking about how she was affected by climate change, how her village was flooded. And so obviously, like, my experiences are not the same. However, I was like thinking about the reasons why I wanted to join the movement. And so I was like thinking about how, for example, my family is from Hong Kong and there is a lot of air pollution there. And so obviously, again, like, our experiences are not the same. I'm not like trying to say that. However, I just wanted to also like understand, because I knew like subconsciously there is a reason why I wanted to join. And another reason why as well, though, that at first I was kind of just like not necessarily the most comfortable being in the climate space as well at first, was because for some reason I still thought that at sometimes it was still like a white dominated space, and there's like always like space for improvement as well. And so for a while, I just wanted to like work specifically in policy, which is why I did research on S7341 and did all this stuff. I actually did talk to Xiye about it like when I first wanted to introduce it. So I did that, and I got introduced into both New York State legislatures, which was really cool because it just shows that even though like you are a young person, you can still make an impact in terms of policy. Like, before even entering the whole space, like I never thought that something like that could be possible. So yeah, I guess that's really how I got involved. And with CSCY as well, the reason why I did co-found it with Kaylee, who is another BIPOC in the climate movement as well. We both founded it because we wanted there to be improvement in terms of who's being represented and who's involved with climate advocacy and climate organizing. So again, like, it's just the bridge between the science community and the climate organizing space that we wanted to connect, while also having BIPOC power this whole organization. And we're also still like working on trying to build a program for BIPOC to propose and write their own laws for climate education and ethnic studies, because they have obvious and important intersections that need to be acknowledged by the general public. So yeah.
Hi, so I actually got started in Austin, Texas. It actually started from a cold email to an organization called Poder, and it's an Indigenous-led organization here in Austin that does a lot of work around environmental and social justice. And I just kind of got taken in and really connected to the community and the different networks that were going on. I got involved in, policy work, fighting for certain zoning laws in city council. I also helped with their youth education program. They have a summer program where they pay youth to learn about racism and environmental justice, to kind of be able to put words to our lived experience, and then to be able to organize around that. And then after working with Poder and working in the community, I got involved with Sunrise, and also Youth Climate Strike. And that's kind of where I got more involved with like different strikes and like youth-led movement. And then later I started Start Empowerment with my friend Kirsten because we realized the lack of environmental justice programming, especially in the city of New York. It's such a diverse city, and obviously there's a lot of low-income communities of color that experience environmental racism, that experience the pollution, but don't necessarily have the words to be able to address that or put their lived experience and really explain that and take action. And so we started working at the High School for Teaching in the Professions in the Bronx, and we worked with several teachers to basically change their curriculum to be really justice focused. And then we worked with the students and started a food justice program to address those issues, and that kind of started the project to work with more schools in order to do that.
I actually got my start in, got my first taste in climate organizing and climate activism at kind of a summit or a forum like this, actually. There was a local summit organized in my town, Rochester, New York, back in the spring of 2017, and there were about 150 to 200 youth from across the region coming together to learn about how to advocate for just, equitable policies in their local town or municipality, ways to decrease their own personal carbon footprint, learning about environmental justice and the intersections between climate and the variety of other different problems and issues that plague our society. And I was so inspired by that room full of bright-eyed youth from across my region that it really inspired me to take more action in my own school. And at that time, my school actually didn't have an environmental club. We didn't have a climate club. So with a couple of my friends at that school, we co-founded the Brighton High School Climate Club. And for pretty much my entire high school career, I've been helping to organize with that group to increase sustainability and equitable climate policy at my school. We were able to get our school to implement a zero waste system along with the sustainability plan. And with some other local groups in our area, through the Rochester Youth Climate Leaders, we were able to get our county legislature to create a climate action plan to detail its steps to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and making sure that as we achieve those lofty goals, that the transition is just, to make sure that low-income communities and communities of color are easily transitioned away from a fossil fuel driven economy to a clean energy economy that works for us all. So I've been really active with my local groups for now 3-4 years. But actually, after attending the New York City Global Climate Strike back on September 20th, a couple of my friends, about 7-8 of us from Rochester, we went down to the city in September 20th. And we were just so inspired by all the speakers there, literally hundreds of thousands of people from all ages, all walks of life coming together to strike against the continued governmental inaction on the climate crisis. It really inspired us to do more. And from that, we decided that we wanted to take our organizing and activism to a new level. And we created the New York Youth Climate Leaders in November of 2019, as I mentioned. And our goal ever since then is to try to create a multiracial, multi-class, multi-generational movement that touches every single corner of the state, from rural to suburban to urban, bringing together a diverse coalition to combat against the climate crisis and advocate for economic and environmental justice for every single New Yorker. And it's really been a really fun and engaging time, and we're really excited to continue organizing for climate justice in the upcoming year.
Thank you all so much for sharing that story. And so it's so nice to hear that you know, some of your organizations had worked before together, or even before your organizations, you know, were founded and were developed, you all had met each other. And us at Solar One, we were also there at the Youth Climate Strike in New York City, and it was a great time. We also, it was so eye-opening to see literally like the hundreds of thousands of people who went. And so that's great that, you know, we were all there, we were all able to connect in some way. So another question, just to move the conversation forward, and this can be for whoever wants to answer, it's not necessary for every single person to reply if you do not want to, but if you do, go ahead. But what do you think other mainly adults, and this can be teachers, adults, activists, adult scientists, our parents, our own family members, what do you think others can learn from youth organizers, from youth activists? And this does not have to be just limited to climate activists. There is a lot of youth activism happening all around the country and the world during this moment, which is super, super inspiring. But I do think that there is sometimes a very big disconnect between youth organizers and some of our adults who are in these leadership positions and these decision-making positions. So what are some things or some, that these adults can learn from youth organizers, youth activists?
I guess I can quickly go with this. That, youth can do what adults can do. That, we deserve a voice at the table, that we know our stuff, and that we deeply care about our future. Oftentimes, in a lot of movements, adults kind of dominate the space. So it's really important that adults engage and bring in youth into the decision-making process when it comes to movement building and coalition building. But then also making sure to emphasize the intergenerational activism component, that, we as youth, we have a lot to learn from our elders and the adults that we work with, and that we're stronger together as an intergenerational, multiracial, multi-class movement, rather than just like a youth movement and adult movement, that we're stronger together as one unified movement against, the fossil fuel industry and the powers to be that prevent us from achieving climate justice and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And making sure that, it's a two-way street, that, we bring in energy, enthusiasm, excitement, but, our adult allies and adult partners bring in a lot of expertise. They've had, decades of experience with organizing. They know the ins and outs, especially as a policy-driven coalition. We've, for the New York Youth Climate Leaders, we've been really grateful to work with a variety of different adult partners, from New York Communities for Change down in the city to 350.org internationally, along with the Divest New York Coalition, which is a bunch of grassroots adult groups from across the state. We've been really fortunate and lucky to partner with such great adult groups that have, valued our activism as youth, but have given us a lot of advice and expertise with their, decades of experiences in organizing. So, making sure that it's a two-way street, but also making sure that adults know that, we as youth, we're powerful, and we're really excited and want to partner with adults to agitate and organize for economic and environmental justice for our nation.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to add something really quickly, because the way in which we organized the September 20th climate strike was in a way in which we tried to make it like non-hierarchical and more collaborative, which is not how we see adult organizations be, or just any adult system be in general. Like, we don't really see places where they listen to each other, listen to different perspectives, actually acknowledge the expertise that comes from experience. And that's what we wanted to do with September 20th climate strike. We really wanted to hear everybody, give everybody a voice if they wanted to start their own little project. Like, this guy wanted to light the Empire State Building green, and that was his own project, and he could do it if he wanted to, right? So I think that a lot of the times adults have to learn how Gen Z specifically is seeing the world, in a way in which we don't want to compete, and it's not about who gets the highest grades and who goes to college, and it's about how we work together collaboratively, because we have been taught in this society to be individualistic and strive for personal success. And that mentality is what prevents us from actually working together for a bigger movement. And that's why we see so many adult organizations who have not talked to each other. And I do not know one youth climate organization that hasn't reached out to another one. So I really want adults to model what we try to do, because also we're not driven by financial anything, because we didn't start this work getting paid or anything like that. So it is important that we want everybody to do this work because they're genuinely pulled to do it and not because they're just making more money out of something, right? So those are the things I want adults to do, and definitely recognize that we cannot build an identity around age. We're not going to be youth climate activists forever, but it is up to every single person to always hold the hand of somebody older and hold the hand of somebody younger, because there are younger kids than us, and we have to also be there for them. So those are my thoughts.
I was going to say something in a similar vein, in the sense that, like, I totally agree with Hridesh, like, adults bring the expertise. I think that the strength of youth organizations and youth movements are that they're more visionaries. And whereas adults kind of see impediments to progress and they conceptualize like what the future can look like differently, I think youth have something more powerful in what Xiye was talking about, that they think of everything as like a collective and what does true like getting to our goals look like. And I think that the biggest way we see this is adult organizations are constantly talking about like how we get one bill passed, rather than like what is the best way that they can empower just say their community. And this applies to just all organizations. I think it's really interesting how we let the minds of a handful of people who happen to have Senate seats get in the way of everything we do. Also, a side note, there are more people in the Senate named John than there are women of color. And I think that tells you all you need to know about how much we should value their opinions. When we organize like collectively and what youth are trying to do is just so much healthier for the future of our country and our world than thinking of it constantly as like, how do we change just a few people's minds?
All right. So that is such a great point, Jade, about, you know, representation, I think is a really important point. And this isn't one of my prepared questions, but just this panel itself is, you know, we try to be as inclusive as possible. We have people with many different identities and hope to be a little bit more representative of the youth movement. And I think that that is something that the youth movement does so well in comparison to some of these more established environmental organizations in terms of inclusivity and representation and diversity that you don't really see in a lot of environmental organizations where it is still very white dominated, some male dominated. There is a high female presence in the environmental movement, but not always a diverse female presence of people of different backgrounds and different experiences. So that is something that I definitely value and is something that I also think that these adult organizations can hopefully implement and learn from these youth organizers. And so just on that, there was a question from an audience member that I just think fits in with this conversation about how are you within your own youth organizations trying to also, because a lot of you did mention that racial justice, inclusivity, and diversity initiatives are very important within your organizations. But if any of you can just speak on how, like the how, so what are some actions or discussions taking place within your own organizations or within just like your peer group, your friends, of how you can use your platforms to try to uplift these marginalized communities that are not really seen in the mainstream environmental movement as much. I do see that that is changing, but it's been a while, and we've been wanting to have this change for a long time. And that is not to say that marginalized communities have not been involved. They have very much been involved and have been leaders within their own community. They just unfortunately have not had that same recognition of their amazing work. So if anyone wants to speak a little bit about how you yourself, within your peers, your friends, or within your organizations, how you are taking that step to try to make your organization and your efforts and your platform to be inclusive and increase representation within the movement.
So I think that a big reason why as well that there is still a lack of representation in terms of, for example, the climate organizing space is because of accessibility to certain meetings. And so, for example, we have like youth that are joining that have never actually been organizing, but we plan on having them, for example, go to the meetings for September 25th, which like people are planning, but we're not gonna share any details about. But but yeah, and so a big reason why as well is because, like, for example, from just like my experience, a lot of these meetings do take place in Manhattan. And when we think of Manhattan, like, who do we really think like lives in Manhattan? Like usually upper middle class or wealthy individuals. And that's a big issue as well that like needs to be kind of addressed in terms of like where we're having meetings. But also I noticed that there's a lack of media representation for people organizing grassroots in communities of color. For example, there's an organization called We Act that we partner with. And We Act is a really great organization. They're Black-led, and they're just like, the whole team is just led by people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so I don't get why We Act doesn't have more media representation, for example. They're doing amazing work, and there's so many other grassroots organizations that are led by BIPOC and even led by BI youth of color. And it's honestly just infuriating because there's like a certain point in which we have a choice to take action and organize, but a lot of like I would say, like, for example, like media, I think that they definitely do have a very large role in terms of like what people are thinking. And obviously like media can't control what people are saying or believe, but they have they have an immense amount of power to influence what people are thinking. And for example, we can influence politicians in terms of like who they're thinking about if like media and organizers are working collaboratively together. And so when we think collaboratively, we specifically as well mean communities of color that are working with grassroots organizations. So yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with like everything you just said. And I think the history of like BIPOC organizing in the environmental space is not something that's very well known. Like I didn't learn about like say environmental justice and like the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit that came up with like those principles and all the different organizations that are working on until very later on when I was organizing. I came across that because it's not something that's taught and it's not something that's emphasized. It's not something that's shown in the media. And I think for me personally, for my organization, we are all POC led and like really our focus is justice. And so the very core of the foundation of like our organization and all the work we do is centered around how do we help communities of color, because communities of color are the ones that are impacted the most by the climate crisis. And so I think that allows us to be a very diverse and very justice oriented organization.
Yeah, and I would just like to add that I think that one of the main reasons why we all started our own orgs is because we didn't see representation in the mainstream youth climate movement. That's why I started Re-Earth Initiative, because I couldn't believe that internationally only European youth and US youth were being represented when Europe and the US are definitely not the most affected places by the climate crisis as a whole, even though there are communities who are affected. And so Re-Earth Initiative really was born out of that. And you know, we have people from Singapore where striking is illegal, so they can't even join the mainstream climate movement. People from Costa Rica and Chile and Mexico and India, where you know youth have not had had not been empowered to really start something until they're 25, or they're like still UN youth, but they're not, like us youth, where we really have a lot of ideas even though we're 18 or 17. And it's actually so amazing how a lot of people just feel happier in the organizing space when we have strong morals and strong mission statements. And our mission statement was, how do we further justice in the climate movement? And how do we educate our communities? And one of the things that we do is we translate all of our toolkits. So all of our toolkits are translated to up to 5 different languages, just because we want information to be accessible to our communities. And if the information is only in English, how do we expect communities to be empowered with information when that's the first thing that got us involved in the climate movement? I, for example, would not have been able to learn any of the things that I do know if I hadn't learned English, which was a very stressful process. And people used to make fun of me because I couldn't speak English. But we can't let people go through that. We have to make information accessible and always meet people where they're at. And the last thing that I wanted to mention was that, right now, there's a lot of international climate agreements that are going around, but the most I see about is like the European Green New Deal, or how European youth are calling for, pushing that petition to get the European Union to advocate for climate legislation. When at the same time, there's this agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean called the Escazú Agreement that pairs human rights and environmental justice. And that is not being talked about at all. So I think that it is our responsibility as a global community to really highlight the agreements that are going on around the world, helping people all across, for example, in the Philippines, where being an environmental defender is super dangerous and they have a really high mortality rate for environmental defenders. That is something that we do not face in the United States or in the global north. So we have to be more mindful, not only in our communities, like New York City, the Bronx is more affected, Lower Manhattan might be protected with a wall, but then Harlem is going to be flooded. So we have to be mindful about our local communities, but also our international communities.
TREEage also thinks of marginalized community empowerment through education. So we recently started the Hive, which is a network of school organizers that are all demanding climate education within their schools. It is on like a case-by-case basis. If you think that your school is going to be more effective in creating like a whole class dedicated to climate change, and that's something you can go straight to like your principal to do rather than a teacher, we encourage that. And we have a whole training camp that's going on right now, where these students can learn how to have those conversations and how to organize. And what's so important about climate education, specifically in empowering marginalized communities, is that you cannot have true comprehensive climate education without highlighting these specific struggles and racism that is like constantly historically perpetuated against communities of color. And when you focus on that through line in history, it becomes an empowering thing where for once kids of color are learning about like themselves. They're seeing themselves in their curriculum, and they're learning who are the activists now who will continue this work. And if you are going to learn about like history of color, about like the history of people of color and their struggles, then you're automatically going to end up with something that ends up being like, how do we dismantle the systems of oppression that still exist? So the Hive and climate education in general is an amazing tool to create activists out of young people. And I know that a lot of the people who are watching right now are New York City high school students. So if you fall into that category, then please check out our Instagram or our website and join the Hive, because it's really an awesome thing.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to echo what pretty much everyone has said, that it's important to see, people of color in the U.S. climate movement, because oftentimes, the climate movements, especially in the global north, have been dominated by white activists for many decades. But also just to emphasize that representation alone is not enough. You need to have people of color in decision-making positions, but also making sure that those people of color actually represent low-income communities and communities of color, and making sure that those people of color-led organizations advocate for just, equitable policies, both climate and economic policies that actually help to uplift communities of color and low-income communities. Otherwise, they're continuing to perpetuate the systemic racism that's so entrenched in our society, continuing to perpetuate the gross income and economic inequality within our society. Which is why, at the New York Youth Climate Leaders, especially in the last couple of months, we went through a really significant revision of our policy platform and our theory of change. Previously we've been very focused on specifically like climate policy, especially with, reducing carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and more direct climate policy. But we realized, we always do, climate is an inequality accelerator, that it accelerates inequality with healthcare, with education, with a variety of different justice issues. So after, especially in the last couple months with the movement for Black Lives, we decided that we need to start advocating for more justice issues. So we included, for example, in New York State, there's a bill in both the Senate and Assembly called the New York Health Act, which would guarantee every single New Yorker healthcare as a human right. That, even in the midst of a pandemic, that we have millions of Americans, disproportionately Black and brown, that do not have healthcare in a pandemic in the richest nation in the history of the world is really, quite frankly, inexcusable. And the fact that, climate change is also a public health crisis. And we know that this issue will disproportionately affect Black and brown communities in our state and in our nation. So in order to adapt to those threats, we must make sure that our public health infrastructure is ready for those problems that are going to come as a result of the climate crisis. So we also included, economic justice as a bigger part of our platform, that we advocate for taxing the top 1% to fund not only climate mitigation, but also education, housing, healthcare. Because we know that disproportionately, especially in New York City, but also in upstate New York too, with low-income communities in rural America, but also communities of color in our urban centers, that we know disproportionately Black and brown communities have lack of housing, have lack of healthcare. Schooling and education is disproportionately worse off than their white suburban counterparts. So we really went through a huge revamping of our coalition and our policy platform to include more justice focusing and to show solidarity with a variety of different justice movements in our state and in our nation. Because after all, we can't have climate justice without having healthcare justice, without having racial justice, without having education justice. That all these issues are interconnected, and we must form a multiracial, multi-class, multi-generational movement that touches every corner of this world in order to overcome the political powers to be, whether they be the fossil fuel industry, whether they be, the military industrial complex or any other, powerful special interests that continue to oppose progress on climate and a wide variety of issues. That we must forge that coalition and work in solidarity with each other and uplifting communities of color in the global South in order to truly achieve justice for all people.
All right, thank you so much for sharing. Totally agree. Us at Solar One as well, we have a lot of work that we need to do in order to, again, try to kind of reword and change the way that our organization, which is a white-led organization here in New York City, the way we function and the way that we interact with different communities here in the city. So thank you all for your insights. And so in talking about youth activism, and some of you have touched upon this already, but how do you think, and this also ties with how some of the attendees are asking, how they can get started. What recommendations do you have for other youth, not limited to just New York City youth, but like youth in general, youth around the world? How can they better claim like the space within these movements, not just environmental movement? There is huge intersectionality within these movements of justice in general, but how can youth claim these spaces that they deserve? And in that same line of thought, how can adults and other leaders, established leaders, people who have that title of leadership, how can they make space for youth? And then how can youth, claim that space and have that confidence that all of you have in, being and recognizing that they deserve to be in that space and they deserve a seat at the table, and they should be included in the decision-making process as well.
Sorry, go ahead. So I would say for getting started, my biggest advice would be plug into like existing networks. There's already so many people in every single community that are interested in different social justice issues and in climate justice. So find who those people are and like plug into initiatives, and then you'll have a better understanding of like what's going on in your community, what's already being done, where is the most help needed. So I think that would be my advice. And I think youth have been at the forefront of so many movements throughout history. Like if you look at, civil rights movement, protests against the Vietnam War, just youth have really had that space, but yet we're not taken seriously. So I think my biggest advice would just be to be persistent and just to keep coming at it, because there's nothing else that we can do except just show up and be there. And I think in terms of like adults or like people that are in leadership positions, it's really important to make space for youth and to kind of create mentorship networks for youth to come in. I found another issue in like a lot of like nonprofit organizations or in like electoral politics, a lot of the positions for youth aren't paid. And I think that is a problem, because while most of us don't do this for any money, a lot of us have to work. And so that becomes a problem when you're trying to spend your time making money, but you also have to organize, and that becomes a lot. So I think including more paid internship positions for youth, more opportunities where you can also do this work and make some money would be really great. And I think leaders need to actually listen to youth as well, because a lot of times leaders congratulate us for our activism. They're really inspired. They're like, this is great. You're standing up for your community. You're fighting for justice. But then we're demanding like, stop using fossil fuel. And they're like, no, we're not going to do anything. So I think the biggest thing is like actually listen to us and not just say, this is great, like take action.
So in terms of what youth can do just to like be involved and how to know about different organizations, I definitely think that social media, especially like now, is like the best way to like find out if there's organizations around you that are organizing. For example, obviously like it's going to be different because it's just like based off of like username, handle, and accessibility, of course. But for example, if you're in the US specifically, like you can like search up like your different state and like see if there's like coalition, or if like there's your city, for example, and there's a coalition. And in terms of like making space, so far there haven't really been any like adults that have been like genuinely making space. I feel that they've been like superficially making space sometimes, because when it comes to like important decisions, none of us are like at the table. And when there are youth, it's like you and youth. So for example, we're gonna like take the United Nations Major Group for Children Youth as a microcosm. It's supposed to be a space for youth to engage at the United Nations. However, whenever there are youth, it's usually youth that are like maybe like 25 to 30 years old, and usually they're the ones that decide who's going to be making interventions at the United Nations and speaking to the officials there. And usually the people, again, like leading the UNMGCY are like 30 years old. However, if there's like a young person that's under 18 that usually comes in, and people from UNMGCY as well, they usually come from around the world. However, it seems that in terms of like UNMGCY, it's kind of like a global north dominated space as well, which needs to be addressed. And so, for example, UNMGCY, if there's a young person that's under 18 that comes into this space and they're being involved, they usually tend to give speaking positions or just genuine like seats in like these summits or conferences to people who are over 18 who can usually just vote. Like it's, I guess in a way it is almost like not like tokenizing, I don't know like a specific word to use because it's like difficult to describe, but it's like tokenizing like young people, not like, it's so, I don't like saying this, but it is just like giving like superficial space to young people, because there's a difference between saying like, wow, we care about young people, we care about youth, and we want to like highlight their work, and there is a difference between offering them genuine seats for change. So yeah.
Yeah, I want to just echo what Cynthia said, that it's really important that, not only that youth have a seat at the table, but they're actually put in decision-making positions. Because, representation is important, but if, people of color and if youth voices are not given decision-making powers, then representation does not serve us. It doesn't, help to advance our goals. It doesn't help to advance our agenda. So, making sure that, youth are heard and their voices are respected and that they have power to make those decisions is really important. At least personally, I've been very fortunate and lucky enough to work with a variety of different adult groups that have really valued my voice and my group's voice and my fellow youth's voice. We've been very, very fortunate to work with a variety of different adult groups in the local area here in Rochester, like the Rochester People's Climate Coalition. I actually serve on their board of directors as their youth representative. So I've been helped to uplift the voice of youth in my region and here in Rochester, but also working with other adult-led groups in the city, with New York Communities for Change, and also across the state with the Divest New York Coalition and 350.org. So there's definitely adults out there, especially in the climate movement, that want to help uplift youth voices. And I think the more kind of like intergenerational divide is more so with older politicians and youth. I mean, after all, the average age in Congress is what, like 65 or 70 or something like that. But the vast majority of the U.S. population is under 65. So clearly we need to have a transformative change with our power structure here in the U.S., but across the world, to sweep in a younger generation of activists and youth who have fresh, innovative ideas that can challenge power and speak truth to power and hold those who've been most responsible for the climate crisis, which is the fossil fuel industry, to account. Yeah, but again, just echoing that representation alone is enough. You need to have youth in decision-making positions.
Great, thank you. And so something I just wanted to talk to you all about, because this is something that I do as part of my organization at Solar One, is talking about schools and education, and kind of, I know that some of your organizations and some of you all mentioned education as being a core component of any movement, of educating the masses, educating other youth, educating adults. And so a big part of what we do at Solar One is that we've been doing sustainability and climate education in New York City for years now. But it's still a struggle in terms of, there's lots of barriers to teaching about sustainability and climate change within the school system. And we're lucky to be able to partner with like the Department of Education and try to increase our reach in terms of how many students and how many teachers we're able to kind of talk and discuss and train and all of that. But I'm wondering on your end, what role do you see schools, and this can be public schools, any type of school, even colleges and universities. So what role do you see schools having in educating people and involving them within justice movements? And a lot of you mentioned, having curriculum where students themselves see themselves represented in that. But how, are your organizations working with like schools and school systems, and, how can schools be better at motivating youth, encouraging youth who want to become more actively involved in, justice movements and all that? So love your thoughts on that.
The first thing that I want to bring up is that it's really hard to change the curriculum of a school, especially, for example, in New York, where it's like the whole state has to change how they do school and the curriculum that they choose. And I think it's way easier in colleges and universities to say, let's add this class, let's add this new professor. For example, I'm taking a writing seminar on environmental justice, and that would have never happened 5 years ago. So I think that higher education is definitely developing to be more conscious about what classes they offer. But it's only after years of petitions and years of pushing for these schools to be more inclusive about what they teach. But even then, most school curriculums in higher education schools in the United States are very Eurocentric. When you think of the core curriculum at Columbia University, or when you think of the requirements of different universities, most of them will teach you Eurocentric ideals of thought, which are not usually very keen on how do we work collaboratively and not try to keep expanding our form of thought, or how do we respect people's ideas and people's diversity. So I think that how we have gone around that, around high schools not changing their curriculum for climate justice, we have actually resorted to talking to our own teachers and our own administration and individual schools. For example, for the September 20th climate strike, my school did a 2-hour teach-in on environmental justice. So every teacher had to choose a topic, and students could sign up to whatever class they wanted. So there was fashion and climate, there was food and climate, there was transportation and climate, and students could go to any of the intersections of the climate crisis that they wanted to learn more about. So even if a specific student's parents didn't let them go to the strike, or they didn't feel comfortable striking, the school still gave us education about the climate crisis. And that's something that should be more adopted in every school. And something that, for example, our organizations are doing, like specifically what Re-Earth Initiative does, is we have a PowerPoint and we do presentations about the climate crisis and solutions to schools around the world. And it's really helpful for kids to have other kids teach them about what the greenhouse gas effect is, what renewable energy is, how it affects your community, how it can help your community to implement renewable energy. And so it's about us teaching each other, and that's what we have learned in the past year, that we're not going to get kind of sweeping change in education unless we make it part of our own culture to teach each other, to talk to each other, to ask our teachers for that change. And when we change our own culture to that, then I think legislation is more likely to follow. And I think we still have to work on both fronts. It has to be like an effort to push all of it forward. But that's how we have been dealing with students, just trying to really make it not like a once a year somebody came to your school to talk about climate, something more, persistent.
Yeah, so in terms of like individual schools, students have a large role in communicating with individual administrators or teachers. However, there's like something that like really needs to be addressed in terms of like New York State public education, in terms of like how to actually have core curriculum that isn't Eurocentric from a macro lens, in terms of like all of New York State. For example, like I have like, although like Andrew Cuomo, he did really well in combating and dealing with the COVID crisis. However, there needs to be acknowledgement about how he does not necessarily like public education. And he, for example, was like working with Google on alternatives to like public education. Not necessarily alternatives, but there's like something else that they're working on. And so when it comes to like bills about climate and bills about education, he tends to like veto them. And so that's like a big reason why as well, like after COVID, there's been a lot of budget cuts in terms of education, which is why it's really difficult to pass a lot of like ethnic studies bills or climate education bills. So yeah, that's kind of something that needs to like be talked about, but hasn't really been discussed on a really big level.
And I just wanted to add, I think in many ways, school have been really complicit in like oppression. If you think about police presence, you think about the school to prison pipeline and how schools are not listening. Like we've been, protesting to defund the police, to remove police from school, and schools haven't been responding to that at all for the most part. But I think I've been very lucky to find some radical space within schools and find amazing teachers and amazing professors that have been able to foster that environment, and I've been able to like read from scholars like, Robert Bullard, Angela Davis, Marx, and all of that, and really found that community within a school. So I think, because as youth, obviously we all go to school, and then we all go to, a lot of us go to university. So like education is really a huge part of our lives. So I think that gives us the opportunity to create those radical spaces where we can, learn about these issues and combine action and education together.
Great, thank you. And so this is another question that was asked by some audience members, but I think it was Xiye who mentioned, we're not youth always, and it's important for us to our participation in climate justice and environmental justice, any justice movement, to not just be restricted to our age. And that's something that I, as I'm aging out of the youth category as well, to kind of see how you are all going to go on with your careers and your studies or whatever you choose to do in your future. So I'm just wondering, how has your climate activism, how has your work, your organizations, how has that impacted your personal career choices or career pathways that you would want to follow through? How has that impacted any, school choices, what you're planning to study, anything like that? As you go on into more schools, universities, into your jobs, into your careers, how do you think your participation as youth activists have framed your future career choices or any, future study choices?
Is anybody? Okay, I'll go because I'm going to college this year. And I think that, my life completely changed when I became a climate activist. And for both better and worse because you are constantly reminded that the work that you're doing it for the survival of, life as we know it. So, and you have to be constantly reminded of loss of biodiversity, communities being destroyed, like all the bad things about the climate crisis, and people's greed, people's inability to open their hearts sometimes. So that's the hard part. But then it's so rewarding because I feel like I have a purpose. I feel like I can do something with my life. I feel like my purpose is to further our connection and our consciousness with everything around us, and that will result in climate justice at some point. So, I wanted to be a veterinarian when I was like 6, and then I wanted to be a biochemist up until 3 years ago because I really love chemistry. But then when I got into the climate movement, I saw that this is not something that I am going to do for high school and then move on, because this is a crisis that is still going on. So I will do everything I can in my power to keep furthering that movement. And so I will be studying environmental studies with a concentration in policy and international relations and a minor in environmental management. And I'm happy about it. I know that it is not fair that I am not able to explore other areas that I would like to do in my life as for now, but I can still do the things that I like, which is talking to people, doing policy work, studying why climate change is even happening, right? And still further the movement. So I'm happy about it. And my whole college essay, all my extracurriculars were geared toward that. And it showed me as a very passionate person in this specific area, which was actually good for me to get into the colleges that I wanted to get into. So it's been a really wild ride, but I feel more independent. Maybe we grew up too fast, but sometimes that's necessary when we are in a movement of this magnitude.
So, in terms of like the climate crisis, it definitely intersects with any type of social justice issue, and de jure segregation is why environmental racism happens. It's why the school to prison pipeline happens. It's why there's a lack of accessibility to resources for communities of color and especially Black and brown communities. And also, in terms of like career paths and career choices, there's definitely different options. Like you can choose a certain passion that you have and try to intersect it with climate, or in terms of like any other social justice issue, because again, it does intersect, and you can't talk about one thing, like for example, the climate movement, without talking about different types of movements around the world as well, and the climate crisis while talking about the social justice issues as well. And so I'm really privileged enough to actually go to a school where we have majors where we can learn about the different topics that we want to, instead of like having like a curriculum where we're all supposed to follow. And in my school, I'm a social science research major, and I have a class called sociology where we're just given different theories and term papers to just like read. And when I'm reading different topics such as social stratification or the crime and deviance lesson as well, it just took me into a different type of perspective in terms of what place do I really have in this society and what role can I really play, because I really do want to work in terms of like environmental policy, or just work mainly around combating the climate crisis. However, there's still so many issues that I want to work on, because there's so many intersecting points in all these different issues. And social stratification is basically the reason why, or it's basically the reason why all these issues connect. Well, one of the issues, not just the main issue. And so when I think about this, like it's made me think about, okay, maybe I should go to law school and maybe study theory, because, for example, you can't really talk about the climate crisis without addressing immigrations, about issues with immigration law. So there's, again, like different things that you can definitely do, and it's just, again, like it's just based off of how you look at the climate movement and how you look at the climate crisis as well.
Oops, okay. Yeah, thank you all so much for answering that. I think that something we really want to let youth know is that there are careers within this field. This is, a job that you can possibly have. You can merge together your passions along with, getting a salary. And I think that that's something important to realize, that a lot of activism is very much spearheaded by volunteers and very passionate individuals, without which it would not be the same. But just so everyone knows, there are jobs, and this is a career pathway that you can possibly take. For me, I am older than all of you on this panel. But I myself, like Xiye was saying, I studied environmental studies with very similarly also minored in international relations, went on to graduate school to study specifically environmental education, just because I knew that for me, education and teaching has always been my own personal passion. But I was able to tie in my personal interest of environmentalism, social justice movements, sociology, sociology and education, and merge that with a job that pays and that supports me, supports my interests, supports my passions, and supports me financially. And so I also see that as a lot of organizations, not only here in the city, but also around the country and around the world, are becoming more aware finally towards like our climate crisis. I do see that there is more careers available within sustainability, within climate, that I see as hopeful for future youth who are trying to enter this movement. And as like a lot of policies and as like a lot of legislation changes happen within the city and like the country, as we, you know, hopefully move away from fossil fuels and all that, we're hoping to also have a larger green workforce. And I'm hoping that more youth who are interested in this field feel confident that there are jobs available. This is a career pathway that is in demand, and you can definitely still pursue your passions of activism and justice with you know, many different pathways that you want to take. So thank you all for sharing that information. So this question may just also be for Alexia, just because Alexia, you're in a different state other than New York. But this is an audience question of how can organizations collaborate within different states where there may be different legislation barriers, time differences, all of this different things, people living in urban communities versus rural communities. So how has that been for you, you know, being from, you know, studying here in New York, but then you know, starting in Texas, I think you said, and then New York, and then, you know, going back. So how do you, and this can go for anyone, but how do you think organizations can work between different states and even on an international platform? Because that makes it a little bit more challenging with language barriers and even more time differences and all of that.
Yeah, so I think for me, there's kind of two parts to it. One, I think it's really important to focus on your community and the community you're in right now and present in, and like the leaders in the communities, the people in the communities, and really focus from there and kind of derive your power from there. But I think it's really important to collaborate with different communities, to learn from different communities how they're doing things, and especially on a national level, on a national platform, there's so many things you can learn from different organizations, you know, across the world. I think personally, actually, We Act has an environmental leadership network, and they have organizations across the United States that are part of that, and also indigenous groups. And my organization that I started with, called Poder in Austin, we're actually part of that too. And they've had conferences around in the summer, and then we had ours on Zoom this year. And it's so I already had some kind of connections to New York and learning about what they were doing here. So that was like really cool to see. And I think, yeah, people just collaborate, they share ideas, different policies that are being passed in different cities and how that could be replicated in another city. So I think tapping into those existing networks and also just reaching out to other organizations. Like if you see a policy that's working in a city, reach out and see like try to find the person, like how did they advocate for that? How is that working out for them? What did they do? And find out what the process was and learn from that.
Great, thank you. Totally agree. Oh, do you want to add something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about rural organizing. So I'm from upstate New York. I live in a small town called Brighton, which is a town of about 35,000, which is a suburb of Rochester. But I organize with a bunch of youth from like rural America in upstate. Some of these towns are like 95, 96, 97% white. So organizing in rural communities is actually not as hard as I think people like to think about when it comes to the climate movement. I think there's like this common misconception that like rural America, which is, you know, majority white, doesn't really care about climate or environmental issues, but that's actually really not true. You know, when it comes to environmental justice, the two groups, especially in, you know, global North discourse, that really get left out of environmental justice, one is the global South, but also the other one is rural America. You know, especially in like Appalachia, in, places where like coal mining or the fossil fuel industry is really the only economic hub of activity. These are the communities that have some of the highest rates of asthma, highest rates of other environmental injustices, highest rates of healthcare costs related to emissions from, the local coal mine or local oil drilling apparatus. So, these communities, even like in upstate New York, rural America, they actually do care about environmental and sustainability issues. So oftentimes the way you have to kind of approach climate activism in a more of a rural community, rural area, is obviously going to be different than the way you approach it in an urban area, where it's oftentimes, focusing on like farming or like local, boosting the local economy, and finding out, what the issues are related to climate in your local rural community, and finding other like-minded youth or even adults that actually care about sustainability and climate, organizing with them to create a local climate movement in your rural community to advocate for just climate policy. And it's definitely possible, and it's really important to also dispel that notion that rural America is not ready for climate justice. It is. For example, our coalition, we had like a 30-person strike for a Green New Deal for New York State in a town that was 97% white, where people had signs showing, we want climate justice now. That, rural America, it does care about climate and it is ready, and it shouldn't be left out of that picture for climate justice in the climate movement.
Great, thank you. Thank you for adding that. Very, very insightful as well. This is another audience question. What do you think are some resources that institutions like zoos, museums, aquariums, national parks, nature centers, like parks department, some of these, institutions that do have kind of like an overlay with environmentalism, how can these, cultural institutions help and support youth organizers, and what resources, like tangible things, can they provide in support for youth organizing? So that can be anything from like museums, city museums, aquariums, zoos, gardens, botanical gardens, nature centers, the entire like parks department within here in the city.
So for the September 20th climate strike, we had a lot of different places in the city helping us with kind of outreach in their own network. So for example, Arcadia Earth, which is a museum by West 4th, did a whole, what's the word? You know what I mean? Like a whole like thing.
An exposition, an exhibit.
Exhibit, yes. On all the signs that we did for September 20th. So they put them up in the museum and it looks so beautiful, and they had different exhibits about the different intersectionalities about the climate movement. And that was amazing. And then we had a lot of businesses, for example, helping us promote it, and companies helping us as well. Like Patagonia did a photo shoot with a bunch of youth climate activists from all over the United States and the world, actually. Ben & Jerry's did also a lot of marketing for it. Seventh Generation also did a lot of marketing for it. So it wasn't even like small places where we asked to put a sign like come to September 20th or hand out like little pamphlets outside, or we would even walk around with a cardboard that said September 20th, like climate strike, Folly Square. It was a lot of places that were willing to advertise it, were willing to let us put it on their little like board. And when it comes to more established institutions, the Met really helped us as well. Like I remember I went there and they told us, we can put it in our newsletter, we can put it out. And a lot of different universities across the city also put it in their newsletters to students. So it's really about emailing a lot. Like that's a lot of what organizing is, just emailing as many people as you can, asking them to reach out to publicize it. And you actually, out of like 30 days of organizing, you're only out in the streets one of those days. but it really pays off because you can see everybody coming together from different walks of life.
I think that physical space also helps. For the climate strike, we also relied on like an actual gathering space in the basement of New York Society for Ethical Culture to meet regularly. Also, like photographers and videographers who are willing to do work that will help us promote whatever like action is coming up. And that's all I have off the top of my head. Also, money always helps, like donations, and as part of their outreach, like in their newsletters, linking your action network or what have you is A1.
Yeah, so cultural institutions can definitely give a lot of resources to a lot of like youth organizers and organizations. However, like as well, there's still a lack of BIPOC representation and even like youth representation in terms of museum curation and cultural institutions curation, and even like academia, because both of those are obviously connected. And so curation has a very large role in diversifying a narrative or just changing the narrative as a whole. And so if youth, and especially like BI youth of color, want to solidify their role in this movement and solidify basically our work, like cultural institutions need to be acknowledging and actively working, and not just like superficially working with youth of color to actually bring about like diversifying a narrative, diversifying basically just change in general. And so I'm not sure if like everyone like also just like knows about like the specifics about the complicity that museums have played in systemic racism in the past as well. Like for example, like the Bronx Zoo literally had like people in exhibits which they don't openly acknowledge as a museum. I don't think so, or like I'm not too sure, but in general, like museums need to be like louder about things that they've done in the past that perpetuate systemic racism, because again, like climate change is an issue that has obvious social implications. And so cultural institutions need to be doing actual exhibits that highlight these social implications, not just in the global north, but in the global south as well. And by acknowledging these social implications as well, they need to be acknowledging the history of systemic racism in academia and in cultural institutions.
Great, thank you. So I have one last question as we wrap up this wonderful conversation we've been having. And this was asked by a couple of other people, but you know, I myself also have like climate anxiety, you know, worrying constantly about all this, you know, on like overflow of negative news, politically, environmentally, just seeing everything that unfortunately happens around the world. So how do you all find yourself to continuously be motivated to continue on with this work, to continue being leaders within your organizations, within your communities, within this country? So what kind of, and this will be like what we'll finish off with, you know, what do you find motivates you and keeps you going in spite of literally everything that's happening, especially in 2020? So yeah, any kind of motivational.
Yeah, it's definitely really tough. I mean, especially like in our country, you know, we've had over 170,000 deaths due to coronavirus, literally tens of millions of Americans out of a job, tens of millions of Americans who've lost their health care. And this is on top of, you know, the climate crisis. We already had a crisis of racial injustice, income inequality, where, you know, you have like 3 Americans who have more wealth than the bottom half of the United States. On top of that, now with COVID, obviously. So it's definitely a very tough time, not only for the United States, but really for across the world. But, you know, to be an activist, you have to be an optimist, that you believe that a better world is possible and that a better world is worth fighting for. So I always, you know, find my inspiration and, you know, refill my optimistic attitude by looking at my fellow youth who organize with me, and the multitude of adult allies who work in allyship with us. That really keeps me going, and also knowing that, I'm fighting for someone I don't know, that, helping to uplift communities of color in the global South who are going to be disproportionately affected by this crisis continues to, keep me going. And knowing that, a better world is possible, that we can live in a world and an economy that works for us all, not just the few, and we can truly address the climate crisis and create a better future for posterity.
Yeah, I was gonna say that when you said climate anxiety, I feel like all of our chests just like compressed a little, because it's something that's really affected, I think, everybody who is in the climate space some way or another. And yeah, it's like once you get out of that mentality of, knowing all the science, then that's when you can start feeling like the climate movement is not stopping. And like I really resonate with what you just said with being a climate optimist, because I think that if we want hope, we need action. And that's something that it's actually real. When you strike, when you do emails, when you are talking to your friends, when you act based on the things that you become hopeful. And like that climate optimism, I mean, like not climate optimism, but like Christina Figueres says, stubborn optimism of believing in humanity, believing in our power of innovation, believing in our power to turn this thing around because we know the information, believing in our power of coming together, of having the biggest crisis that we have ever seen, which is also the biggest opportunity to change the world to what we want to see. So that's how I stay grounded and so keen on doing this work, because I believe in our power as humanity to move forward together.
So obviously it's so easy to just get lost in being one in like 7 billion people in this like world, or just like being really fixated on the fact that this is like a really macroscopic society, and just forgetting about the fact that there is agency. But it's just like focusing and like fixating on the agency, which kind of just gives me hope, because each person has their own single story, and each person has a purpose, and they have ambition, and they have dreams. Like, I don't think that there's a single person that wants the world to just basically end. Like, no one wants that. And so if there's just that fixation on agency and the fixation on the individual stories, I think that that's just been giving a lot of hope to me, because I think it is just really like thinking about how insignificant we might be in this world, which gives us a lot of climate anxiety, and just like a lot of anxiety about things just might not be changing for the better. So again, just like thinking about the individual stories, which I also really do kind of like suggest just like talking to a lot of like other organizers and just like getting to know them as well. Despite this whole pandemic, I think that what's just been keeping me in check and with everything that's been going on around is just like again, like speaking to others and like understanding that there's other people that are obviously feeling the same things that you're feeling, and it's totally normal. So yeah, just like feeling a connection with other people definitely helps.
For me, it's about, for me, it's about building a community. And I think that I conceptualize climate change and my role in the movement more as the fight against systemic racism. And that's something that I can't personally give up on. I also think that like the solutions and the future that I see uplifted like by other climate activists is one that's created by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And that's the future that has never been able to be realized because of white supremacy in history. And it's like that specific future is what motivates me to keep going. And I know that if I don't contribute to it, or if I give up on it now before it's fully realized, it will never be realized. It exists in some form now because we continue to sustain it.
And I think echoing on what everyone said, and it's something that I'm still working on too, to like continue being hopeful, because it's definitely not something that's easy every day. But just like, yeah, relying on my community, the people that are in this with me, and then also like the elders like that have been doing this for so long, that have been fighting, you know, for like over 50 years and that are still doing it. Their hope really like brings me hope as well. And I think it's also really important to like take care of ourselves, like Audre Lorde said, like self-care and like self-love is a form of like resistance. And I think it's really important that all activists really engage in that.
Great. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to thank everyone who joined us on the attendee side. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. All information from these wonderful individuals and their organizations is going to be emailed out to you. So you will have their websites, all of their social media handles, emails maybe as well. So thank you everyone for taking the time today to talk about this very important issue. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much to the 5 of you. This was a wonderful conversation to have. I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. And I hope that we can, you know, stay connected and offer whatever support we can in whatever capacity to you all.